we give the floor to you.
Thank you so much for having me. And I really appreciate that you're emphasizing the local aspects of it. And I'll be talking a little bit more about that. I want to say hi with my face for a minute before I go to the PowerPoint. So you can all see who I am, partly because I know that a number of you are high school students and you might be thinking, oh, where am I going to go to school? And we unmute.
Looks like you muted. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. Hi, everyone. I'll start over. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. And I'm going to say hello this way before I go to the PowerPoint. So you can see my face for a minute, just because I know some of you are high school students, and I know that you will be on our campus at UW-Madison. And I look forward to seeing you in a few years or next year. But put that on your list, because it's a great place to study and to make these local to global connections. And I think of myself as a global, engaged globally as well. So I'm going to turn to sharing a PowerPoint, and it'll just take me a second to do that, and then we'll get going. Hold on. It's gonna stop your screen share when I share mine, which should be fine. Can you give me permission to share, Pam?
I think maybe Pam just has to end hers, and then
okay, that's
should work
fine
for you.
That's fine. Okay. If mine does not come up readily, as in momentarily, I am going to ask folks to run it from there, but I think I found it. I think it's really no problem. Let's see. Yeah, I think I am going to ask you to share it, because it's not giving me my screen openings the way this. There you go. Wonderful. So I'm going to talk today about using the Sustainable Development Goals as a framework to guide local and global change. And I know you've talked about the goals a lot, and hopefully I'm going to share some of my lessons working with them. And I think you'll notice that I've used the word framework rather than goals here. Part of it is, it's one thing to have goals, but I think when you're in a time of crisis and people's lives are on the line, you work as hard as you can to achieve what you want to achieve. It's not about targets or meeting a goal. It's just about doing as much as you can. So sometimes when we talk about the goals, it gets distracted into, can we meet them or not? And when you're talking about saving the lives of children, you know, your moral obligation is to try and do as much as you can, whether you can meet a specific goal or not. So I like to use these goals as a framework. And if it's a compass, you know, like the Big Dipper is pointing me toward the moon, it still helps me. And so I think of this as a very useful framework. Next, please. I'm going to talk a little bit about my professional journey, what motivates me. I was asked to share that with you. And then what I think global change can be using the SDGs for our efforts locally and globally. Next, please. So this is a little bit about me. I've been a Peace Corps volunteer. I consider myself a Badger because I've been here for 20 years. Did my undergraduate studies at Yale, and I did my graduate studies at the Harvard School of Public Health and the Harvard Divinity School. I'm from Rhode Island, which is kind of near those places, and I've lived in Madison for 20 years. When I went to college, I was the first person in my family to have the opportunity to go to college, but my family armed me with so much kind of smarts and ways to care that, you know, and they were very proud of me, and also reminded me that I didn't know everything just because I had a college degree and they didn't. But I just think, you know, wherever you're coming from, just thinking about doing all you can and learning all you can, you know, to serve others is really important. And higher education was a really important ticket to serve for me. Next, please. That's my family too, my sweet family up there. I think of myself as a public health leader and practitioner, but life is full of many things. And I also do really enjoy writing. I enjoy Peace Corps. I wanted to show you, I was once like you. There's picture of me when I was just starting in Peace Corps. And those early decisions, which can seem like such a big choice, I still refer to my experiences in the Peace Corps for wisdom, and I'm still in touch with some of the young people I worked with to this day. I did write a book about it if you're interested in reading, and I mentioned the TED Talk here, which was already mentioned. I say that because sometimes young people want to hear stories about what it's like to do the field work. And this talk is not about that, but if you're interested, you can watch it and you can write to me. I tried to make some interesting stories out of things, and it was enjoyable to do. Next, please. So what about the SDGs? I see the SDGs as pathways to human thriving and sustainability. I've thought about this a lot. I lived through the era of the Alma Ata conference, where we talked about health for all, the Millennium Development Goals, and then which we're gonna, health for all by the year 2000. Millennium Development Goals was by 2015. And then in 2015, we realized we needed to recommit to those pledges and do more, think more holistically. And the neat thing about the SDGs is the other movements, which were important also, really had a global north, global south mindset, as if there were rich countries and poor countries. And this whole project was about rich and poor countries. The SDGs are different. They're about all of us, and they are not just about nations. They're about local government. And it's really important to think about how can we advance the SDGs locally as well as globally. And I think that was a big takeaway for me after working, under the Millennium Development Goal framework for many years. And now I start thinking, what would I say in 2030, when this 15-year period is over, about how we might adapt them. But the SDGs, there is global consensus that this framework can help us to think across disciplines and do the best that we can within disciplines. Here, you have this image of the SDGs, and on the left, you have these boxes. They're almost like little labels. And on the right, you have this wheel. And I like to use the SDGs both as tags and as a wheel, because you can look at a challenge you're working on and say, oh, that's SDG 6, that's water, or that's SDG 4, that's education. And that's powerful, to name how you're part of the global movement. But it's also useful to put what you're working right in the middle and say, wow, here's what I'm doing. How does it relate to water? How does it relate to education? This might impact, gender equity. This might impact other kinds of equity. So there's a way in which you can think of this as a holistic web to respond to complex problems. And both of those strategies are important. And I'll tell you a little more why as I go into my lessons. Next, please. So first of all, let's take a step back. What does sustainable development really mean? There are some misunderstandings about this. The initial articulation of sustainable development, which I was among those in the audience, 1987, I was already doing global health and development work. Sustainable development is the development that meets our needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. So we were already thinking about you. You were not even born yet. And we were thinking, wow, that's really important. We want to care for the earth. We want to make sure that we leave things, better than we found it. Now I think that's a low bar. We want to make it easier for you, to thrive. But at the time, it was honestly like an insight to think that way about the future. Next, please. So sustainable development is sometimes misunderstood. And one lesson I've learned is that to be able to talk about sustainability, especially locally, people can think that you are only talking about environmental sustainability. They're worried that it's going to get in the way of their earning a living or other things that, they're thinking about. But really, sustainable development has as its foundation 3 pillars: environmental care, social equity, and economic thriving. So it's already this kind of sweet spot, this beautiful and where, we can thrive economically, but in a way that protects the earth. We can thrive economically and make sure that we're making things better for people who have, the least amount of resources or have experienced marginalization historically for all the reasons that you thought about in the land acknowledgement and so forth. So this is a really important point, because most people can get on board with this agenda. There's that intersection in the middle that we can work toward. Next, please. And in terms of this imaginary, you can see how you go from those tags, which are useful, to the wheel. There's another there's another shape I want you to remember, which is this layer cake, birthday cake or wedding cake, with the idea that this biosphere, this environment that we have to, that we're charged to protect and we want to protect, is foundational. It's not replaceable. So really, that's at this foundational layer. Then you have the social layer and then the economy. So there is kind of a hierarchy in the SDGs, and environmentalists will often use this model as a way, instead of just three intersections. Let's remember we have some resources that we can't replace. Next, please. So the other word I want to talk about defining is the word global. And you heard the word glocal. And I like that word and I use that term sometime. But I want to sort of think about it in another way too. For many, many years, we talked about global as being, you here to there, right? I'm going there. It's global. But there's another way to think about global, which is developing a global perspective. And in a way, when you go somewhere, you don't really leave home and you don't really ever leave the places you go. Your world gets larger. When I hear a news story about Honduras, where I lived for 2 years in the Peace Corps, it's a place in my world. It's different than, if I hear something about Mars or whatever. And so that idea that your world keeps getting bigger, it's very much, you can think about it when you were in first grade. Your schoolyard was your world. You get to fifth grade and you start, visiting state capitals. You go to college and you start thinking, gee, I do want to, see the world or see the whole state. And those are here to everywhere ways of thinking, and, letting the world change you as you think about how you might want to change the world or preserve, sacred things in the world is a really important principle. And the other thing I like about this idea of the world getting larger is it's just as true for you as it is for a young person in Germany or South Africa or Ecuador, that when you come together, both of your worlds are getting larger. So rather than it being a concept grounded in the global north, where, people who can afford to travel have this privilege, all of us have this idea that our worlds are getting larger and we bring a global perspective to what we do. So you can do global work without leaving your town. And you can take a trip and not have done global work because you didn't really take in, the perspective of being in that larger space. I often say too, we work in Wisconsin because we live in Wisconsin. Why would we work in the world? Well, we live in the world as well. We're in both of those places. Next, please. So just some examples of global, when you do international work, you might be better and more prepared to do work, say, related to immigrant health or issues, or you might be better prepared to deal with transnational issues like climate change, or you might be able to look at innovations that are happening around the world and figure out how they can be adapted and shared. Or you might be able to, address an emergency that transcends national boundaries. I actually made this slide, something like this, before COVID, but I'm able to add, COVID to it. So here you see pictures from work that my students and I have done all around the world. And it really is, making those local to global connections and this around the world and back again, and, letting the world change you kind of thinking. Next, please. So you can scroll through this one. There's a nice short video that I'm not planning to show on this particular slide, but I know that the resources get shared, and so I put it there for you to have. But you can go to the next slide. This is some very famous people talking about the SDGs. So lesson 1, what do I recommend to you? Well, I think you should dig into the SDGs you care about. Sometimes we grab the tagline, SDG 3, health for everyone. And we forget that there are sub goals between 8 and 15 sub goals for each of the SDGs. And so those are called targets, target 3.1 to 3.3, you see them there. And it is important to look at the sub targets of what you're working on, whether it's water and sanitation, whether it's education, to be holistic, and it will help you think of things that you might not thought of. So here are some of the sub targets for SDG3 related to communicable disease, infectious disease, maternal and child health, and so forth. And so go to the level of the targets for the projects you're working on, look at the targets. That's taking an SDG and going deeper. Next, please. Then another lesson, which is the opposite of what I just said, is take that SDG and link it to the others. So here you have the World Health Organization. Again, I'm using health and SDG 3 because global health is my area of expertise. So you can see how they've put SDG 3 in the middle there, and they're showing how it's related to all of the other SDGs. So it is related to almost all of them. And I'll show you a more detailed slide with the targets later. But this is beginning to have that wheel-based or 360 kind of thinking, right? So using the SDGs as tags with clarity to name things is very important. And it's also useful to use the whole wheel in a 360 way to help optimize what you're working on so that all the benefits that you might be able to, draw out of it are drawn out. Next, please. So here is an example of that. We've got goal 3, and on the left, we have all those sub-goals listed. But on the right, we have some particular linkages to other SDGs. So, you see linkages to SDG 5 there. The way I'm reading this now, I can't quite read it, but I think you can. And you can see linkages to quite a few of those. And these kinds of analyses are visualizations that you can use to make things clearer for folks. And later I'll be sharing an app that we've developed at UW-Madison that can help you create some really neat visualizations that show, your challenge, what you're facing. You can even put an image in there, but then they'll link it to the other SDGs and these sub goals so that you can get into the details. Next, please. So this is called 360 thinking, and I've worked on some of this with local governments and also with health. And next, please. And there are 5 things that I want you to think about with your projects. Probably you'll feel like, oh, we were already thinking that way, or we're already doing it. This is not 5 things I made up. This is 5 things I noticed by reviewing good work and saying, what were the strategies that arose that made SDG work more effective? Working with the SDGs isn't always effective. You could work very hard and then have this dismaying outcome that people will say, well, we don't care about the UN SDGs. That's overwhelming. It's very complicated. We want it to be simpler. And you kind of need to use some of these strategies to communicate about the SDGs well, because people are busy and they have a lot going on and they want to deal with what's immediate. So here's 5 things I learned about. The first one is explain the SDGs with local examples. You need to show why this is relevant and urgent. And useful to the people that you're speaking with. There's no reason why they should care about things that are very, very far away from them if they have immediate concerns. And so you want to make those linkages. The second thing you can do when you're working, particularly if you're working with an organization or local governments, like I work with a lot of cities and towns and mayors, often those city plans don't mention the SDGs at all. And yet the Sustainable Development Goals, it is a mandate for cities and towns everywhere, right? But rather than saying, oh, you're not doing the SDGs, what we do is we look at what they're doing, and actually they are doing some of the SDGs. They just weren't calling it that. So to have this kind of asset-based positive start, we do a matrix or a crosswalk that I'll show you, where we show, where you are doing SDG work and then identify where you might do more. And that's a better way to make change than to start, as the smarty pants critic. That usually does not work, even though it can be fun. Let's be honest. You want to be respectful and really look at what people are doing. Probably are already doing some of the things that you would like to see happen. There's also a whole movement around voluntary local reporting relating to how we're doing. And there's a lot of details about that I'm leaving outside of this discussion today, but there's data about a lot of different cities and countries. And then there's this wheel-based analysis that I'll show you a little more, where you can really use this app or your own, manual tools to analyze your problem and link it to all of the SDGs. And finally, and most importantly, therefore it's final, centering equity inclusion in all of these conversations. It's more creative, it's more fun, it's better work, and it's more just, and you can put those adjectives in any order you want. Probably just is first, right? But I'll show you some and some sort of points about that. And the article that was referred to in the other slide, you can get into all the details by linking on that and getting to the article. Next, please. Next. So here's an example of strategy 1, making it local. Here you have SDG 2, hunger, right here in Wisconsin, the River Food Pantry. Some of my students did some work to increase the night access, and they tagged it with SDG 2. So you can see they're doing local work, that's really important, and it highlights the SDGs. Next, please. Here you have, a lot of times we think, oh, these aren't about the US, clean water. Well, lead is a big challenge, and lead and other kinds of contamination in the water are a big challenge. And here we're linking SDG 6 to challenges in Flint. You could be talking about Milwaukee or many other cities that have longer term plans to get the lead out of our pipes. So it's a big issue, PFAS, other things, right? So clean water and sanitation, not trivial. Next. Now, the second one, I'll show you some crosswalks. Next, please. This is a great example of New York City. They had a big strategic plan with these 4 visions. You can see resilience, sustainability, just, and thriving, right? And that was done before the SDGs came out. It was like 2014. So afterward, they did this matrix analysis where they showed how the SDGs were related to their city plan. So rather than redoing the plan, they were able to make the linkages, and whatever momentum they could have from being part of the SDG movement, they could gain. And so guess what? Next, please. Madison also had a city plan with some very specific goals, culture and character, health and safety, economic opportunity, housing. Next, please. And some UW students in my class did a matrix analysis where they put the SDGs on that left axis and the Madison plan on the right, and they showed, where are they doing well? Where could more work happen? So when we went to Madison leadership, we weren't saying, oh, you're not doing this. We were saying, look at all the things that are happening. There's more that could be done. Next. Then we can go on. Next. This is some examples of this voluntary local reporting where cities from around the US have said, look, the SDGs aren't binding, but we think they're very important. And if we report on how we're doing with transparency to our citizens, that creates a movement and an accountability, an expectation of accountability that could be very helpful. So this is something you can read more about. You can read in particular about Baltimore, but all of these examples are great. And there's some tools here if you want to do voluntary local reporting work. Next, please. Then we have this SDG 360 analysis that I'm very excited about, worked on with students for a while. Next, I'll show you some examples. This is where we take that idea. Imagine if you could have eyes in the back of your head and see all the way around you. That's the SDG 360. And here, what we've put in the middle is urban health challenges. Maybe it's, related to respiratory illnesses or something. And we've done the 360 with all the targets for all of the different ones. So each of these SDGs had those sub-targets like we saw in number 3. And here, all of the ones that are relevant for urban health are on the graphic. So suddenly you have this holistic model, and this helps you to find co-benefits, which is an optimizing thing, and you can get more support by saying, hey, we're doing this thing related to health, but it's going to help, with education and so forth. It can also help you find errors in your own work before you implement something. It's error proofing. When people design cars, they crash test them, right? They put dummies in there and they try to hurt them so that they can keep us safer. And we need to sometimes crash test our social interventions in the same way, and our policies. And so this tool allows you to crash test it with the knowledge of these targets. And then finally, we can look for areas where there might be trade-offs in terms of equity. And sometimes an innovation gives you a net benefit, but there's one group that is not going to benefit. And you can either decide you're not going to do that because of the inequity, or you're going to correct the inequity with a complementary strategy. But it allows you to be really much more transparent about equity. And so this is an example of an SDG 360 wheel. Next, please. And here's an example from neighborhoods in housing. They were just working on neighborhoods and housing, and you can see how they linked that neighborhoods to poverty, to food, to education. Suddenly housing seemed more important because all of these people who might be centering other things can see, wow, that housing strategy they're mentioning will help with jobs. It will help me, hire folks that can get to work on time, and it will we need to make sure that we, plan that the schools will be able to serve these new neighborhoods well, and so on. So this is another type of visualization that we call the pinwheel. And you can see how you put what you have in the middle. It's kind of like a pinwheel, right? And it makes it easy to see how things are connected. I see some questions coming in, and I'll look at them at the end because it's hard to actually be narrating the slide and seeing the comments, but I'll go right to it. Next, please. Now, centering equity inclusion. How do we center equity inclusion? Next, please. You might, my answer to that is often, that's a good question. And by that, I don't mean I don't know the answer. And I don't mean that I do know the answer. But part of the answer is a good question and a good listening. Asking questions and encouraging dialogue that is not just questions. For example, if I were with you, I wouldn't just have Q&A, who wants to explain more. I'd ask these questions, what does this remind you of? What do you want to share? What do you agree with? What do you disagree with? These are ways to get people discussing things. And if you share your work and you simply, does anyone have any questions? That kind of continues to be, you're the answer person, you're the expert. And if people don't have things they don't understand or they want you to say more of, they won't necessarily say anything. But these kinds of prompts that you see here encourage dialogue. Does anyone have any experiences they want to share related to this? I'd love to hear about someone who don't agree with me and why. That would be helpful to all of us. That way you're inviting people to who might be too polite, but they disagree. So think about good questions, time, and also going back over time to questions. A lot of times we have a one and done mindset toward community dialogue. And in fact, often people are just beginning to trust you, in the beginning of a conversation, and it is much better by the third time is when people will start saying, I feel comfortable with, and I'm going to tell you what I really think. So community listening sessions, even, one is, it's hard to get real input with just one. Next, please. Some other things that can help us with equity inclusion are the SDGs themselves. So here's SDG 10 that gives us some sub-targets that look at inequities. And you can see that they get really specific. A number of that, some have to do with money, some have to do with voice. There's a number that relate to migration, which really gives you a great framework to think about that a lot of times you might not think about. Next, please. SDG 5 is only one of my big favorites, but this is gender equality. When you look at what these say, the work isn't done anywhere. And this means, gender equality for all types of person, boys and girls and every color of the rainbow. We want to make sure people can all be represented in running for office and have the same access to jobs and good health and digital knowledge and being free from violence and harm and all of those things. And so gender equity is just as useful and relevant, in higher resource settings than in lower resource settings. And so anyway, there's so much you can do. And I know young people I've learned so much from young people. I'm almost, I almost don't like to sort of lecture or speak about equity without remembering that I'm going to learn something from folks when we have these conversations. Next. So there is an app for this. You say, is there an app for that? Yes, there is. And you can access it for free. Just go to sdg360thinking.org and it walks you through these steps and explains what I've explained. So you should be able to use the app with ease if you want to develop a visualization related to your projects. Next, please. And these also, just so you know, in case, especially if you come to UW and you want to work with me on this, we have a Spanish webinar that explains all of this with examples from Latin America. We have a Chinese webinar that explains all this with examples from China. We're developing something in French. We're developing something for Africa because you really need to adapt the things you're doing for local context. Adaptation for local context is one of the most important global skills. And it's really learning from comparative contexts and, being excited about what you don't see and how that's going to unlock a piece of the puzzle for you. And instead of being embarrassed to admit you didn't know something, hey, I just learned something from you. Usually people feel good when you say that to them. Next, please. And from UW classrooms to local communities, more than 3,000 young people have been trained in our in our human ecology programs, in our global health major, in our global health certificate to work at the community level on these kinds of challenges. So please join us as students when the time comes. You've got one of the best universities in the world right in your backyard. We wouldn't be what we are without our students. Next, please. So now I have, and I'm going to leave it to facilitator discretion. This is a really fun video that some local folks did in Cleveland. And if there's time to play it, I would love for you to play it. And while you're doing so, I'll look at the comments and either answer them in the comments or be prepared to briefly answer them afterward. It should just play because I have a little tag button in there.
Lori, can you share with us, please, how long the video is?
I think it's like 2.5 minutes.
Perfect. Good to go.
I can't click on this particular slide from where I have it. I'm wondering if Pam or Andrea can open the slides and dig out the link. Or Lori.
Yeah, I'll try. Let's all try, and whoever's fastest. Oh, I seem to, let me, yeah.
If you have the link, then I can do that.
You might hear something. Let me see. Can you hear anything?
No.
Okay, hold on.
But I'll see if I can find the link real quick.
I'm going to try to play it from here because it's not as important to see, and I'm very mindful that you have time to keep it. Can you hear anything? Not yet, huh? Sorry about this.
That's okay. It doesn't seem to be embedded within the slide. I just accessed it. So thank you.
Okay, well, I will look at the questions and maybe I'll send that link and you can play it at a break later in the day since that might be a better way to use the time. I'm sorry about that. So in the comments here, we have business and organizations around the world are also engaged. Yes, and it's in fact, the private sector is sometimes ahead of the public sector and NGOs in this way. And there's two things about that. One is sometimes the private organizations they're doing the work, they're doing it for marketing purposes and it's not necessarily deeply authentic. So that they call that sometimes greenwashing, right? But that's not all that's happening. Some, people will always take advantage of stuff. There's, I would say mostly you have companies that are trying to take a long view toward their businesses and really authentically engaging with this framework. It's really exciting to see. And one recommendation I have, if you're having the ability to work with the private sector, really begin with whatever SDG is most important to them. You can introduce them to the 360 kind of at step 2 or step 3 because they are going to be focused and they're going to be very wary of scope creep because of the efficiency of the business mindset. So say it's a toilet paper company or something, SDG 6 is going to be the question, and then you can talk about that, and then you can get into other things about maintaining forests and other kinds of things later. So starting digging into one SDG is really important. Fun to think about using this approach for curriculum mapping. Pam wrote that. I have thought about that. This could be a great framework for K-12 science education. It's so meaningful, and you can because it is really very science-based. Now, there's also wonderful space for thinking about how the arts and the humanities and the various histories associated with how we got to where we are come into it. So, there's a lot of that kind of connection in the K-12 curriculum anyway, but it really is the case that you can have a lot of fun with going over this iteratively. In 4th grade, you learn what the 17 are, you learn targets later, and then by the time 2030 comes, your class can be making recommendations to the UN of how things could be, right? And then private sector versus nonprofit sector. I think in the nonprofit, and again, this is in case you're working with your projects with nonprofits, one thing that helps them with the uptake is doing the crosswalk with their mission or their strategic plan, but also whoever their donors are. If their people who are funding them are SDG aware, then helping them tell their story in ways that highlights the SDGs can help them, stay alive, because they are doing a lot of fundraising to do the social good that they do. And these kinds of things are tools. In education, I really think teachers are the key. And as an educator myself, systems of education they're not the most rapid to transform. They tend to be stable entities. So I like to think about how to work within the learning objectives that we have as a first step. And then once it becomes familiar, actually changing curricula and learning objectives, it's an easier ask for education systems than the rapid change, just because there are so many exogenous challenges facing education systems right now. But a lot can be done, even if you just look at you can tag your own curriculum, just use tagging and it's already an activity. You can get students to go around their own communities and find challenges and think about how does it relate, which SDGs does it relate to? So whether it's invasive, invasive plants, or challenges with the water supply, or recycling that isn't happening, or whatever. They can biodiversity issues, those kinds of things. And they can also look at positive as well as negative things. We have sandhill cranes running around our campus now, that's because people cared. So there's a lot of good news as well. I don't know if there are other questions. Feel free to raise hands or put them in the chat.
Lori, thank you. This presentation has been amazing. And I know there are so many thoughts and feelings that are swirling around in my mind and heart. I want to invite participants to use the chat, if you would, to kind of shower Lori with a waterfall of not only gratitude, but like what's on top for you from what she shared with us that you are going to take away from having listened to her remarks. And we will be sharing out access to her slides and the recording with your teachers, with your Global Scholars Program coordinators, so that you can refer to them in the future. But I'm not going to talk and type at the same time, but if I were adding my reflection to the chat, I think one of the things you shared early in the presentation, Laurie, about like everyone in this room, in this shared space, is here because we dare to care and we want to do something to make meaning and to add value, right? To engage in collaborative work for change, to improve conditions. But you said, like, we're here because, we want to change the world, and we need to stay open to the world changing us, right? That letting the world change us piece, I think, is so powerful. So that's one of the messages I'm taking away. People are starting to drop a lot of words of appreciation and their takeaways into the chat. And once you say goodbye, we'll make sure that you have access to kind of a summary of what's coming up, especially from our students. In closing, did you have any final words or comments to encourage our young people?
I would just say, that I know it's challenging, the lives you're living, the childhood you've had with, COVID and war, and there can be so much doomsaying around you. And there's always been reasons to fear, and there's always been reasons to feel hopeful. And I just think, we have a moral obligation to be hopeful, not because it's Pollyanna. It's a gritty thing to look at the world and say, I'm going to be hopeful and do my part. And that is what my colleagues around the world do. Don't be afraid and have fun, because we're not going to get a moment when everything's okay, so we can feel joy now. We have to find joy within the struggle. And sometimes the friends that you do the work that you're doing with now will become lifelong friends, and because shared work is the most beautiful way to make friends. And so, don't let our generation put a wet blanket on your dreams for the future, because you guys are going to lead us, and we will follow. We will help you, and we will follow. I see people saying, which one do you think? I'm a 311-5 girl. Okay. I'm going to tell you that. Yeah, because health, gender equity, and cities, and by gender, I mean for everybody. I don't mean, to put women first. I mean, I think there's a lot of ways which boys and men, can enjoy more caretaking in their lives and, live life longer and not have violence and so forth. So I don't know. That's what I'm going to say. I know 4 is super important, but I'm a 311-5, 4 person.
That's a great icebreaker for our next gathering, for
Yeah.
people to introduce and
Now,
identify
where your
themselves
numbers
aligned
instead of
with
then
a
you can
UNSDJ.
play the lottery with those. Yeah. Anyway,
Lori, thank you so very much for
you're
your
welcome.
time and sharing your experiences and just encouraging us to stay hopeful and stay
Yeah.
engaged.
Yeah.
So,
And I mean it when I say look for me at UW-Madison, young people. I will take your emails and look forward to, directing you toward teachers who can really be useful to you. So it's great to know who you are and what you're doing. Thanks.
beautiful. Thank you. Please join me with a round of applause, ASL round of applause for Lori. Thank you.